Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing. With your hosts, Mercedes Pollmeyer and Katja Dev.
So welcome back to another episode of Modus Cafe. And in this episode, we're going to be chatting briefly about failure. And, you know, as climbers, we embrace this every session. But really, it's all about reframing failure. And it might not be like we kind of move through the world feeling like failure is one thing, or maybe it's really hard to define. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And Katja is really going to be taking the reins on this conversation. Yeah, and I'm really excited to have a reframe around failure, because there's so much involved in it, and it can really hold you back if you hold a firm belief about failure. So yeah, hello, Katja.
Hello. It's good to be back. Yeah, I absolutely love the topic of failure and talking about it and talking about reframing failure and what failure really is. And part of that is because climbing is a lot of falling, right? And we often consider falling to be a failure, or even just the way climbing works in terms of projecting, right? And even just what draws us to climbing is actually the challenge of a climb, which also implies we're likely gonna not do it most of the time, and then we're gonna do it a little bit of the time. So climbing inherently has a lot of what you might call failure built in. And now different people think about failure differently. And I'm not an expert on failure. It's just something I'm very passionate about, and I just love talking about it. So today's episode is more just about defining failure. I'm going to give a definition. You can take it if it resonates with you. And then I'd like to suggest some reframing of failure. But I do also know that there's some people out there who really love embracing failure. So there's really different ways of how we can get about. Why is it important to talk about it? Because as you said, Mercedes, I do think it can hold a lot of people back. It can either hold a lot of people back, or maybe more importantly, I think it can make a lot of people unhappy, because it can make us feel like we're not good enough. And now all of a sudden, the sport that we love turns into a prison. It turns into something that we don't enjoy, and it kind of puts us down instead of lifting us up. And I can easily see this in a lot of athletes that bring a lot of passion and enthusiasm to the sport, only to, in the end, feel like, now I'm not good enough. Now I suck at the sport, and like all of a sudden the joy turns into hate or unpleasantness. Let's call it this way, or unhappiness. And that's why I love talking about failure. I feel like it's the elephant in the room, but I like talking about elephants in the room. So here we go. And actually one piece that sparked the conversation is something I see a lot, and I just saw it myself. I just reviewed a video of a climb on a moonboard that I almost sent. So this is a really hard benchmark. It wasn't even a big project, but it's a really hard climb. And I made it through 2 cruxes only to fall at the very last move. And when we do Instagram, you and we do Instagram, I usually just like to post videos of sends. Like when we send boulders, I like to post a video. And I asked myself the question, wow, I don't want to post this video of this climb that I climbed I climbed 95% of it, but I didn't finish it. I'm like, well, is this not a success? Like, why do I not want to post it? So I did the opposite. I actually posted it on social media. And I posted it with the question of, do you see this as a failure, as a win? And I like to start with that as a reframe, because I think a lot of people might relate to this idea of, if we climb a certain route until the very last hold, but then we don't finish it, do you consider this a failure, or do you consider this a win? And this is really important to think about, because even if you just ponder this question for yourself, you might learn a lot about yourself. So here's the question that I would ask is, if you've just climbed 95% of a really difficult route, why would you not celebrate as a win? You just did really hard work. You just did amazing work. But then it's almost like the more of this amazing work that we do, the closer that we get to sending, the harder we are on ourselves for not sending. It's almost mind-blowingly ridiculous, right? So I see this a lot. And of course, I see this in myself. I've done a lot of work around this. Now I actually feel the opposite. I, get really stoked when I fall at the very end because I know I just did something amazing. I just did a really good climb and I'm just missing 1% or 2. And I also know chances are pretty good that I will send in the future. And that feels so good to me. And this is a whole different episode. I love talking about confidence too. It's a whole different episode, but then to be able to show up to the same climb, knowing you can do it, whoa, that brings a whole nother layer of joy to it, in my opinion. And so I'm really excited to go back to that climb. Next time, Mercedes, do you want to say something to this before I keep flowing in my monologue because I can't stop? Okay.
I thought it was really good that you made a distinction between winning and sending. That's 2 very different things. But I also do wonder if we're conditioned. I think we are so conditioned to really only celebrate the outcome over the process. Like, we're just not conditioned to celebrate the process, and I think that's a lot of our work as coaches for our athletes, is to continually remind folks of the process. But it's yeah, the conditioning is just not there. It's like, oh, I only deserve the recognition if I send it.
Yeah, that is true and sad. True and sad at the same time. And yeah, thank you for saying that. I definitely think there's a big difference. It's a huge difference, like you said. And it's interesting too, because if it's only about sending, well, why don't we just all choose easier problems? Why not, right? If you truly want to send, because I'm actually not here to tell anybody why they climb. If someone tells me, well, Katja, I climb because I like to send, I'm like, great, choose your problems based on that. But I would say a lot of climbers do love the process. They actually love the process, but they don't acknowledge their love to the process. And maybe that's because we're conditioned to always even when we write resumes, right? We only write finished things on it. Like, who would ever write, oh, I finished 80% of a certification? You only write a certification on the resume once you've finished it. But guess what? If you do 80% of a certification of any kind, you probably still learned a lot. And so I think it's really worth reframing that and considering that. And what is really important, what it comes down to, before I give another reframe, is for people to remember why they climb. I like to remind my athletes of it. Most people who I talk to tell me they love to climb for the climbing's sake. Most of the people, love to just climb. They love the process of climbing, of moving on the wall, of feeling strong, of connecting with other people. There's a lot of reasons why people climb. And let me tell you this. The funny thing is that if people don't send a route, or if they only send 95% of a route, all these reasons or for why they climb are still there, and they met those goals. If you love to climb for climbing's sake and you climb 95% of a route, well, congratulations. You just did what you love doing and why you're here. But I think it's important to remind ourselves of that. It's especially important as sport climbers, and I have definitely been there before, when you literally fall one move from the chains, because you've just climbed so far only to fall one move from the chains. And I will admit, it is frustrating. It is frustrating, but that is why it's almost more important to be like, hey, I just, did most of this route. This happened to me when I climbed my first 12D. It took me, I think I fell at the chains, I don't know, 3 or 4 times, like a lot. But I then, I pretty much climbed a 12D almost 4 times in a row. And I kept telling myself this. And because I knew I was only one move away, that's not a crux move, those were huge wins and I could do it consistently. So that's another one. If we're able to consistently do something, but we keep falling at the same place, we tend to be really hard on ourselves instead of winning or celebrating the fact that we are so consistent and getting to the very last hold. Now, there are tactical approaches if people do want to send, and we're not going to go into them now. We can do that later, of what you could do if you're stuck at the same move over and over again. For sure, there are tactical approaches. But today we want to talk about failure and kind of reframe it, because the truth is it does weigh us down. There's always this conversation about weight and climbing and, the weight to strength ratio. And sometimes I joke about, losing weight quickly by just dropping all the baggage, the mental baggage that we have, and we would climb literally a lot lighter. And I think, not to go into this too deeply, but part of that has to do with us really being in the moment. The more we worry and the more we're afraid of failure, the more we're not actually connected with our body, and the less well we can perform. That's sort of a side note to the reframing of failure, because it is kind of a big topic. And I told Mercedes this will be a short podcast episode today. I didn't want to do a deep dive, but I'd love to do a deep dive later. If people are interested in that, let me know. But I want to talk about failure in another way, to reframe it a little bit too. We just talked about this idea of, celebrating how far we've come in a certain route. And this also goes for training and strength training. Obviously, you can apply these principles for a lot of things. And I even gave the example of applying it outside of climbing too. But I also want to talk about failure, what failure actually is. And I'm going to just ask you, and perhaps you might want to pause this episode if you actually want to think about it for yourself. But I encourage everybody to think about, what does failure mean to you? Meaning, not what does it mean to you in terms of what it tells you, but how do you define failure? How do you define you just failed on something? So pause this episode if you actually want to think about it. It's a really important exercise to do, but I'm going to move on for sake of time. One thing that I find that's really interesting is that, people struggle often to really define it. And it's interesting because we are quick to judge ourselves. We don't even think about it. It's almost like subconscious. We judge ourselves and we think we failed, we didn't achieve something. But when we really think about it, we struggle with defining what failure actually is. And so if you look up what failure is in any dictionary, failure does exist, in the sense that when there's an expectation of something to work a certain way, and then it doesn't meet these expectations. And my two favorite examples that you have heard me say before, Mercedes, is, let's say we get into the car, we turn the key in the ignition, we expect the car to start. That is an expectation. It's a legitimate expectation when you pay a lot of money for a car that it should start. We turn the key, it should start. If the car doesn't start, that is a failure. There is failure. That is a failure. We should go, to the mechanic to figure this out. Or let's say heart failure, our hearts are expected to work a certain way. And some people who get sick, often in older age, might have a condition called heart failure. And then a medical doctor might diagnose heart failure as a condition. That is when our heart does not work the way we expect it to. It's called heart failure. Now, heart failure is not actually, we're not actually dying at this point. But I just wanted to give two physical examples of what failure is. So failure does exist. But what's really important to keep in mind, especially for climbing, is that failure means, for most people, to not meet certain expectations. Right? That is failure. And if you think about it, let's say if you expect to send a route and you don't do it, that is a failure. But the interesting part here is that I want you to take away is that most of the time it's you setting the expectation. You are the one setting the expectation, so you're the one creating that idea of failure at the same time. Now, again, there's some people for whom that works. Some people, don't mind failing, and that is totally fine. I think that is just a different approach, and that's kind of slightly a different topic. But if you are someone who's really hard on yourself, consider who is setting the expectations, right? And if you are the one setting the expectations, you can also remove that prism that you might put yourself into when you think about failure and when you think about you not being good enough because you didn't achieve a certain goal, right? I think that is really important. Because let's say, what if my goal was to only climb 95% of a route and I met that goal, right? And what it comes down to then is a couple things. One is to even just knowing that our failure is just relative to our own expectations, and then asking yourself, well, where are these expectations coming from? Because again, why do we climb? These expectations are often set arbitrarily. And when I talk about goal setting, and an expectation is kind of like a goal, I like to start with, is this really your goal, or did you borrow that goal? And what you said earlier, this idea of we don't celebrate the process, because we need to send in order to feel good about climbing. Well, that is a goal that we borrowed kind of from society. Like, who says that we need to finish a route like to make that be successful? Where's this coming from? It's different if you set your own expectation, but then again, keep in mind, where's this expectation coming from? And if you reframe that, you can just, reframe that expectation, and you can reframe your own failure from that expectation, going back to why do you actually climb? And if you set expectations and goals from that point of view, you might not reach a point that you might consider failure, And I want to say two more things. One is kind of maybe a funny story, which is, outside it's somewhat arbitrary, but inside it's somewhat arbitrary too. This idea of what is the top of a climb. It's mostly a person decided this is where the climb finishes. There's some arbitrariness to this too. Of course, we have boulders and we top boulders. I'm not here to speak absolute truths, but I just want you to think about reframing this idea of success. Let's say we climb at the gym. Someone put a hold on top and calls this a top. What if I now change that and I just now removed it and I put this sticker that says top on it to the second to last hold? Would you feel different about your achievement? Like a random person just said, this is the top. Don't let other people define your own expectations and successes. Sort of, that's what I wanted to say to that when we reframe failure, because we see this a lot. I see this a lot in athletes. And what I often see is that expectations to do certain things don't come from themselves. It's not truly what they want to do. It's an arbitrary goal that people want to reach. And unfortunately, people can set themselves up for failure. It's kind of like setting yourself up for this unpleasant path. And along the same lines, kind of it goes along with this. It's really like learning to embrace the process. And you can embrace the process of learning by either reframing failure or reframing success even. And really, really deciding for yourself, what is the journey that you are on? Where are you wanting to go with this? Why do you climb? Why do you care about topping this? And if you really do care about topping this, what gets you to the top along the way? Which successes and which wins get you there? And just see, try that on, like a dress when you go climbing, try that on and see how it changes your climbing when you start celebrating your wins instead of always just focusing on the failures. So when I did this Instagram post and I asked people when they climb 95% of a route, meaning they fall at the top, do you see the 5% you didn't do, or do you see the 95% that you did do? And most people said, yeah, I can only see what I didn't do. And that is only sad to me when it makes people really unhappy. And, that's often what I see. And I think, to me, the ultimate expectation, I think, from climbing that people might consider is feeling joy and happiness. I think most people start the sport because they find some joy in it. And that's what I like to shoot for, personally. And that's what I want my athletes to shoot for too. Bringing that joy back into climbing. Wow, that was a long monologue on my end, Mercedes. Would you like to add anything to this?
Oh my gosh, I had so many thoughts, but just with the last comment you made with like, it's okay to have fun and find joy, because like, I remember this like a lot in my like in tennis training and other sports training that I did, that if you were having too much fun, you weren't trying hard enough. Like, this is something I've heard a lot of coaches say. Um, and it's really interesting to me because, like, somehow we think that if we're having fun, it means that we're never going to achieve the super high goal, like that having fun doesn't equal trying hard. And I don't believe that at all. Like that I really wish I had this frame of mind when I was a teenager playing tennis. Because tennis to me was never really like, it turned out to not being fun for me because I was always trying to reach the certain level and I never really hit that level. So I think that some people will feel like, especially with the expectations, that if they're not striving for something high, that they're not pushing themselves, they're afraid that they're not pushing themselves, or they I don't know, may not never reach their potential. But I don't those things don't exist like separately. They exist together, where you can have fun, you can try really hard, you can celebrate your wins, and also achieve big goals. Like that, those can all exist together. And failure doesn't have to take such a huge part of that vision. Like, it's almost like a block, and it's really hard to move through that if it's always there. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I really
Mhm.
love what you said. I absolutely agree that reaching big goals and fun can absolutely go together for sure. In fact, I would argue, who is more likely to show up to the gym to train consistently towards their goals? Is it the climber who enjoys training and enjoys climbing and has fun with it? Or is it the climber who beats themselves up and, drags their body to the gym?
Yeah.
Now, I will say there's kind of this other piece of compensation that I cringe because, oh, I could talk about this forever. There's some people compensate for not feeling worthy, not feeling strong, and then they try really, really hard because they need those outside achievements in order to feel worthy. That happens for sure. So for some people, that is actually a means of being really driven, we talked about this, being really strong. Some people who are really strong are the ones who actually don't feel strong, which is why they are strong, because they're compensating. They're always training out of a lack. But I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind too is, at least, when we work with our athletes, we just really care about people being happy. Like, results is one thing. We do want people to reach, their goals, but I think ultimately we just want people to be really happy. And unfortunately, we've both seen this in climbing a lot, where, climbers who get serious about climbing end up doing the opposite. They just end up being quite unhappy. And that's really not what we want. Life is short. Like, and again, that's why it brings me back to, why do we climb? Most people who we work with, that's not their professions. Most people come into climbing usually out of some sort of feeling for joy or connection, or balance. There's something that brings, people to climbing that's usually not outcome based at the very beginning. And then it turns into this outcome based goal. And we just like to reset this. And again, I'd like to argue, I never really believe this, that if you enjoy something, you'll get really good at that, because you also want to keep practicing and keep doing that very thing. And sort of lastly, I want to speak to this idea of falling being failure. Again, I think falling and climbing is part of the process. It's part of the practice, you know? And it's not a failure when we fall. That's just naturally what happens. It's like when you hit a ball in tennis and you hit the net, or it goes out of bounds when you practice. I mean, that's why you practice, in order to make your shots really good, right? And it's just interesting because climbing, because this idea of falling in our brains has this idea of falling down. So by the very fact that we fall in climbing as part of our sport, it can make us feel like it's a failure, because we're also falling at the same time. But really, falling is just part of the process, of climbing. And so for that, I think, it should be embraced.
Yeah. So I do want to talk about expectations for a second. And I think that like we have these high expectations of ourselves, and when we don't meet those expectations, okay, like we believe that's failure. And so to reconcile that, like it's too simplistic to say, like, one, it doesn't feel quite right to say, well, I just have really low expectations, because that doesn't feel good. And it also, like, I think that having no expectations is a better way of moving forward. Um, but that also doesn't feel quite right. Like when you're approaching something, like you're about to do a thing, I guess for myself now, it's almost like I'm just ready to see what happens. Like I don't even know if I use the word expectation anymore. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I'm so glad you asked this because this is really important. And people do have this question because there's people who are like, oh, I just show up with low expectations. And when people say low expectations, they don't actually mean low expectations often. Unfortunately, they mean, how can I say this? What's the word for it? Kind of like low self-esteem or low self-worth, or like being like, oh, I won't be able to do this anyway. That's not a low expectation to me, but that's a whole different story that goes, into confidence. And actually, that's not what I'm trying to suggest here either. So thank you for saying that. I think there's a couple of reframes. I love what you said, which is this idea of no expectation. Well, that's my favorite way to think about it. Kind of like no expectation and just like giving your best and seeing what happens. And it's a very you could call this Zen-like approach. There's other philosophies out there, this idea of just seeing what happens and taking things as they are. And then, if your expectation is just to give your best, essentially, you're not going to feel that expectation if you give your best. If that is kind of like your reframe. So I love the approach of no expectation. Again, it's not a low expectation. It's just no expectation. The expectation, well, the goal is just to try my best for the state that I'm currently in, with the conditions that I have, with the amount of sleep that I got, with how crowded the gym is, anything, just to give my best. And then putting not too much value and weight into the outcomes, really, and how they tie into my self-worth and what it now means about me. And for that reason, actually, I so clearly there's all these reasons for why we could climb well one day and not well the other day. So the no expectations, I think, is a lovely approach. It's really great to practice. I love that myself. But I will say something about another reframe. And honestly, in the end, it just comes down to how people use language and how people use words. Because I think you could have an expectation too, or you could have a goal. Let's call this maybe more of a goal versus an expectation, or both. But what's important to keep in mind is when you don't reach that goal or expectation and you quote unquote fail on something that you set out to do, before go into an emotional, roller coaster about that and make it, into your self-worth, or like tie that into your self-worth, I think whether or not you like to call it setting expectations or no expectations is just keeping in mind where these expectations come from and where this fear of failure comes from. So I actually think if you can handle this, having high expectation works well if you're someone who can also realize, if I don't reach them, that is okay. And so different people work differently, and that also works for me. I love setting high goals for myself, and I'm very okay with not reaching them, because for me, setting high goals means I'm going to go as far as I can, and I'm able to see how far I've come. So I love that approach for myself, but it doesn't work for everybody. So I don't think there's anything wrong with setting expectations or setting big goals. It's just kind of what it can do to our mind when we don't reach them. And I think that's more what it's about. It's just remembering who set those expectations and who's defining the failure. I think that's all I want people to think about.
That's awesome. And this, I feel like this conversation is so, like, the timing is so good because I'm actually starting to play tennis again.
Oh, you
Um,
are?
yeah. We'll see how consistent I can be because it is kind of like whenever I can fit it in. But it's really interesting. You know, I played yesterday for the first time in maybe over a year or two. And that expectation in my, like, as I was on the court, my expectation was what I was 20 years ago. I'm
Mm,
like, okay, 20-year-old me played very differently to what I am now, and my body is very different. And you know what? I kind of just went in, and as I played, like, I hit a lot out, I hit a lot in the net, and I was like, you know what? I actually just love being on the court and running around and swinging the racket and feeling that movement. And that brought me so much joy. And I realized that I didn't, like, again, like, I didn't find a lot of joy in tennis when I was playing. Um,
yeah.
and I'm hoping that that's going to change as I get back into it.
Yeah, that's very exciting. I'm excited
Yeah.
for you, Mercedes.
Yeah.
That also
Um,
reminded, yeah.
yeah.
Can I just share one more thing? Actually,
Yeah.
it's really, I think it's really important. And I almost forgot about it. So thank you for sharing that story, which is sometimes our biggest successes make us, make us feel like a failure in the future. So I want to talk about this concept because it's really sad. It's almost like our successes are our downfalls at the same time because we often compare ourselves to our best versions of ourselves. And that's what you just described. Like, yeah, at some point you were a really great tennis player. And so in some ways you could argue you will never be as good again. So now does that mean you're going to be like just shitty for the rest of your life and failing for the rest of your life because you were so good one day? Well, that's really sad because now all of a sudden the success that you had, the accomplishment that you had actually makes you unhappy down the road because you're always comparing yourself to that best version of yourself. And so same for climbing when people have this idea of, oh, I used to be able to do this, or last week I was able to do this, or yesterday I could do this. It's almost like one of our accomplishments that we've had, like the higher we go in terms of our successes, the further we fall on the other end. That is so sad. Like, I want people to be able to celebrate their successes that they had and then still be okay with where they're at after they had those successes and not use those successes kind of as the prison they put themselves in down the road. So it's almost like really sad in some ways. It's almost like I don't want to help anybody be successful if what they're going to do afterwards is just feel bad about themselves not meeting their previous selves anymore. So I think that's
Mm.
another reframe to keep in mind, especially for people who are injured. That's when I see this the most. People who are injured significantly and they used to climb really well, they have a longer road to get back to where they were. So it's almost like they're suffering because all they can see is the top of the mountain that they can't just come down from, instead of seeing how far they're coming now as part of their injury recovery success. So I think reframing is really important. I think language is really important. So well, I
Yeah.
hope this inspired some people to just think about it. I didn't necessarily want to provide any solutions. We talked about this before. Sometimes when you talk about mindset work, it's easy to think, oh, just give me a solution, just give me a band-aid or something I can do. But in the end, it's really just exploring yourself. And I think by just like even just exploring yourself, you're going to find probably a lot of weight lifting. And I like to use the analogy, I'm going to leave everybody with that. I like to use the analogy of, when little kids are afraid of monsters in the dark, they don't want to look at monsters. Like they're like, oh, there's a monster in the room, but they don't want to look at the monster because they're so afraid of this monster. But because they don't want to look at the monster, it's even bigger because they imagine it to be really big. But as soon as you turn the light on to actually look at the monster, they see, oh, that was just a shadow casted from this tiny mouse. So just really just looking at the things that we're really afraid of, just looking at them can help us so much.
Deep. Whoa. Awesome. What a great topic. And we'll end there. Yeah, so thanks for that insight, Katya, and we'll talk to y'all soon.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.